Okay, go ahead, Dr. Jenkins.
My overall, the overall theme of my paper, in fact, the title is Should Land Claimed by White Slaveholders Have Been Redistributed to Former Slaves as reparations for slavery. And what I attempt to do is examine the efforts of former slaves to attain land during Reconstruction, and then offer some thoughts about what the successful redistribution of land claimed by white slaveholders to African slaves could possibly have meant for a contemporary discussion of whether reparations should or should not be granted to the descendants of African slaves. But before we get to that, I offer some background in terms of the colonial experience of slavery. During the colonial period, the southern colonies of Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia's economies were based on staple cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, and sugar. And these economies centered around the use of African slaves who basically dominated the economic sphere for several decades. The work was arduous, and though slave labor was the economic linchpin of the South, slaves received no monetary compensation for their labor. In the seven cotton states, 1/3 of all white income was derived from slavery. By 1840, cotton produced by slave labor constituted 59% of the country's exports. Moreover, according to historian David W. Blight, in 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of Americans' manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. Thus, it should not be a surprise to learn that the South was willing to go to war to preserve slavery. It was literally the foundation of their prosperity. And then I discuss, to a large extent, what colonial slavery looked like in terms of not sanctioning marriages between slaves, how slave families were separated on a regular basis, how slaves were prohibited from receiving instruction in terms of education. And then what I do is move from there to a discussion of what life looked like for slaves for former slaves in the post Reconstruction period. One of the things to take into consideration is the fact that during the Reconstruction period, a number of laws were passed which improved the status of individuals of African descent. The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the Enforcement Acts 1870 and 1871. But essentially, what happened is during the post-Reconstruction period, it was a backlash against black rights, and the United States Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, Reese versus Cruikshank, and the civil rights cases of 1883, as well as the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896. Most of those rights were made null and void, and the 15th Amendment was essentially wiped out as a consequence. State constitutions being revamped first in Mississippi in 1890, in South Carolina in 1895, Louisiana in 1898, and North Carolina in 1900, and that gave rise to the enactment of racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws, in which great segregation permeated throughout the whole of American society in terms of hospitals, penal institutions, restaurants, movie theaters, hospitals, cemeteries. And essentially, the impact of those racial discriminatory laws was still intact, even as late as the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And it took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s to restore to restore and expand many of the hard-earned rights that African Americans had previously had almost 100 years earlier. And so when I conclude, since the land, and I preface claimed, since the land claimed by white slaveholders were not redistributed to former slaves as a form of reparations, then I posit, for instance, had it been redistributed, maybe, in all likelihood, the economic gap between African Americans and whites might be more narrow. But if that was the case, in addition to redistributing the land claimed by Southern slaveholders, what would really need to have happened is a revamping of the whole political, economic, and social system in the United States, where you would have to have had the federal government essentially enforce the rules, regulations, and the bills and the policies that had been enacted during the Reconstruction period. And because of a lack of time, then I'll conclude. I have much more to say. I had prepared about a 30-minute presentation, but I concluded at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You might have a little more time because we're down 2 people. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, if I have.
Go ahead, Dr. Arnold.
Okay. If you want me to continue, I mean.
We'll get Andy and then
you can come back to me.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
All right. Okay.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Thank you for that talk, and I kind of want to end up where you end up. I think the greatest lost opportunities for justice in American history were after the Civil War, the failure to redistribute land to slaves, plantation land to slaves, and the GI Bill following World War II, the greatest predictor of your family's capacity to keep its status, its economic status in the 1970s was whether or not your family owned a home. And for a vast number of Americans, the reason why they owned a home in the 1960s and 1970s is because of the GI Bill guarantees. What people don't seem to realize is that the GI Bill was the GI privilege of buying a home with a government-backed loan was limited to white GIs because of redlining. So for example, Levittown. How many people have heard of Levittown? Yeah. Levittown was, you could only buy if you were white. So I agree with you. There's 2 greatest opportunities. What I wanted to talk about today was racism. I just got back from a conference at Bard College where a man named Ibram Kendi spoke. He's a winner of the National Book Award for his first book, Stamped from the Beginning, a comprehensive history of racism, and his most recent book on anti-racism. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit was the structure of how slavery and ideas of property get us to today and get us to these examples that you laid out. So the concept I want to start with is ubiquity. Ubiquity. The idea of the recognition that sometimes some things are just so with us that we don't see them anymore. There's a famous old joke that goes like this. A couple of fish are swimming in the water, just swimming in the water and minding their own business, and a dolphin comes, swoops down, says, "Hey, how's the water, boys?" And the fish go, "It's fine, the water's fine." And the dolphin keeps on swimming, and the fish go, "What the hell's water?" Water's what you swim in. Water's what you don't even see. One of the unique things about human beings is that we have the ability to swim within our culture, to live within our culture, and also be aware of it. It's also exhausting, right? To be aware of what you're doing while you do it. It took me a while to recognize another example of ubiquity, that students always had cell phones with them, that we could do things in class that we'd never been able to do before because it was always with them. It took me a while to recognize that the schools where my kids go to have such comprehensive anti-bullying programs that to them, bullying had become ubiquitous. It was something that they had to root out, and they could only root it out by designing entire curricula, designing entire structures around ending bullying. And those of you who've been to high school and middle school recently, you remember all those anti-bullying programs. Testing as well, right? You can't get away from high school without recognizing how important testing is to everything that your principals and your teachers stand for. Their every day begins and ends with anti-bullying and protesting. Well, if you can bring yourself to think of racism in a similar way, as something that's part of the air that you breathe, that racism is simply part of the way you live, then it raises the question, for one thing, of the sparse attendance in this classroom. I was thinking on my way in here, what would it take to administrate anti-racism in the same way that we administrate anti-bullying? It would take a complete reshaping of your classroom, a complete reshaping of the way you went to high school. This, of course, brings me to the United States Constitution and to the history of racism, to the problem of racism. John Smith, who was one of the original white settlers, conquerors of America, once said in 1628, he said, "No man will go to here, from here to there, for less freedom than he has at home." He was talking about England, and he was talking about the freedom to own property. A lot of times it appears in textbook in mangled form as the precursor to the Declaration of Independence. It's really not. If you look at the context of that book, what he's really talking about is the freedom to own property separate from the king, the freedom to own property in fee simple, the freedom to absolutely own property. America is founded in a radical approach to property that is unlike anything that we've seen in world history, and it ends up getting applied to slavery as well. Slavery, as you know, is something that goes back all the way in human history in traditional ways. But in America, we were the first to radically commercialize slavery, to try and solve the problem of slavery through absolute ownership and ownership of descendants. And in order to do that, we needed to perfect the most effective brand of racism that the world had ever seen. Let me illustrate that. David Bryan Davis and Orlando Patterson, two writers that you should read. David Bryan Davis, coming out of, I think, Yale, wrote a book called The Problem of Slavery. And here's what he meant by the problem of slavery. It wasn't that slavery sucked, okay? Although I think we concede that it did. The problem of slavery, no matter what the system was, is that slaves were both human and property. That slaves were property and also irreducibly human. So in America, with our radicalized, commercialized version of slavery, to the point where we owned not just slaves, but the descendants of slaves, relatively new idea. commercialized slavery required that slaves enact their status as property, that they act like property. This is the problem of slavery. To slave owners such as James Henry Hammond and other ideologues, slaves had to be like oxen. Slaves had to be like all their other property. And any evidence of humanity on the part of slaves, of free will, slave owners used to say there could be only one will, one moving will on the plantation. So that means that any evidence of humanity on the part of slaves was evidence of rebellion, was evidence of rebellion against the very idea, this really tender, this really fragile, brittle idea of slavery. So that's the problem of slavery, is that slaves had to do this very human thing. They were required, on pain of beating and on pain of death, to act like a stereotypical slave. Got it? To act out their role as less than human. So by physical force, they were required to act. And I'm repeating this because I want you to remember that part. To act like slaves. Because you also recognize that faking, acting, playing a part is an irreducibly human thing to do. So America, at its very founding, trapped itself within the problem of slavery. The problem that says that slaves are both property and human. And you can see it in the legal system, right? One legal system for slaves as humans, one legal system for slaves as property. You can also see it in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which is seen in different ways by abolitionists, assimilationists, and by slave owners. The Fifth Amendment says that all persons must be guaranteed the right to their liberty. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, if you're an abolitionist, this means that obviously you cannot be enslaved. You cannot have your life, liberty, and property deprived. If you're a slave owner, it means you cannot be deprived of your human property. We see this again in the 14th Amendment, almost identical language, this time aimed not just at the national government, but that all state, local, municipal governments as well, that says that all persons are citizens and all persons are due equal liberty under the law. And it takes the racism that America was founded on to read the 14th Amendment in the entire Jim Crow period as defending not the rights of human beings, but only the rights, the human rights of corporations, which was sort of a new thing. So that the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment both were entirely deprived of their ability to protect slaves and then former slaves. So I'll end where I began. This is water. We're swimming in our own culture, and it's hard to see it. Sometimes it's exhausting. And it raises the question about how we see the world. You know, Donald Trump recently talked about how he was getting lynched. And some of his supporters agreed with him and some didn't. In America, to deprive lynching of its racist underpinnings, of its logic of racism. Remember, lynching was not carried out by hate groups originally. Lynching was not carried out by hate groups in the 1960s and 1970s. Lynching was carried out by sheriffs out of uniform, by the leading citizens of the town. Lynching took place against African Americans, and it took place against labor activists. And that's about it. So I'll leave that there.
Yep, I would,
Thank you.
could I make
You
a
want to
few more?
respond? Sure.
I want to pick up on a few points that you raised. I want to really address what it was like living under segregation. I remember I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, segregation was still very much intact. I remember personally the separate drinking facilities, one saying white and the other saying colored. I personally remember separate bathroom facilities. I personally remember separate restaurants. I even remember situations in which whites in Raleigh, North Carolina did not want African Americans to sit down and eat and drink with them. But individuals who own restaurants still wanted the money from African Americans. So what they oftentimes would do is put a petition in the restaurant, and they would cut a hole in the point of it, and African Americans would be on one side with deficient resources, and you would order your food, and then they would push it through the hole, just like you would if you were a dog from way back, because we don't treat dogs and cats that way now. And then what you would do is you would take the food and you would put your money down, because you couldn't touch their hands with the money, because it would be perceived as being to have contaminated them. So you would have to lay your money on the table, and then they would take a rule or something and then slide it to themselves. And I remember separate parks. African Americans in Raleigh, North Carolina had Chavers Park, and whites had Pullen Park. Pullen Park was superior to Chavers Park in so many different ways, although Chavers Park was superior to the black parks in Winston-Salem and in Greensboro and other areas. Now, Pullen Park is the park that everyone go to in Raleigh, North Carolina. And on one occasion, 3 African-American youths climbed over the fence at Pullen Park and went for a swim, and police officials caught them. As a consequence of that, Pullen Park's swimming pool was cleaned out and was not used for a single year. And then the swimming pool at Chavers Park was also closed down. And we had separate movie theaters. African Americans had movie theater in Southeast Raleigh, where most African Americans lived. And the name of that theater was the Lincoln. We were proud of the Lincoln, but the conditions of the Lincoln compared to the Ambassador, which is where whites went, were in fact deplorable. Oftentimes, whenever we were watching the movies, we would have to also contend, not with the mice, but to contend with some of the rats that were in the Ford movie theater. But we were happy to have a theater. I also went to segregated schools until the 11th grade, and the only reason why I went to a desegregated school in the 11th and the 12th grade is because of forced busing. So as a consequence of forced busing, I went to a desegregated school in the 11th and 12th grade, and because African Americans and whites had so many preconceived notions and ideals about each other for about 2 or 3 years. I mean, all kinds of fights broke out on a constant basis. if you were African American and you wanted to use the bathroom, you better make sure that you went in with 4 or 5 other African Americans, and the same way for white students. Because if you went in alone, there was a real possibility that you might be triple teamed or even beyond that and beaten to smithereens, and sometimes they may even catch you and put your head down in the commode and flush it with your head down in the commode. And I got witnessed on so many different occasions the N-word being flung around, in particular at not only younger African Americans, but at adult African Americans. My grandmother and great grandmother were referred to by white kids 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old as mammy and whatever they wanted to call them. So I remember segregation quite well, and I remember when John Baker Sr. Became the first African American on the police department at Raleigh, North Carolina. African Americans were so proud of him, but he nor the next few African Americans had any jurisdiction over whites. Their jurisdiction pertained only to African Americans, and so whites had no constitutional obligation to abide by whatever an African American enforcement official said to them. So I remember the system quite well, and these were the Jim Crow laws that had been put into motion in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and I remember wanting to go to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, wanting to go to Wake Forest University, and not having an opportunity to go because of segregation. We were simply told by our teachers and by the guidance counselors that it was a pipe dream. If we were 6'8", and maybe 215 pounds and could play football, basketball, maybe. But even that, when I graduated from high school in 1973, was still, a slim possibility. So I remember it up front, and my grandfather, my father's father, who I had never met, was in fact lynched himself, and right outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, in the Zebulon, in 1928, 1929, and it so scarred my father that it took those scars with him to his grave, and he pointed out that on a couple of occasions he and some of his cousins, after finding out who killed his father, they waited for hours to kill them, but they did not show up, and they realized that had they been successful, then that would have been the end of them, because they would have been the victims of lynching themselves, vigilante justice. So, I remember on a first-hand basis what it was like, and so therefore, I really embrace to a large extent the United States of America that we're living in. And today, I mean, we got a long ways to go, but thank God we've made really a tremendous amount of progress.
I guess we're all historians here. There's one other point I'd like to pick up on, then we could open it up for the audience. And maybe before we close, if each of us could say maybe 1 or 2 books or articles, which would be good for students on this topic. But you both brought up one of the really critical missed opportunities of United States history is the Reconstruction era. You said land's not redistributed. I'd be curious for both of you to comment, if you could, what would it have taken for the United States to do that in 1865? It's done a little bit in the Sea Isles of South Carolina, but it's not systematic, it's not permanent. And what would it have required for the United States, do you think, to do that in 1865?
You want to go for it? I can go. Doesn't matter.
I guess maybe just one of the things I always stress is I teach a Civil War class. In the Civil War class, we look at Civil War and Reconstruction. And the positive of those is you focus on those. A class like that, in its way, though, also distorts that there's many other things going on, and not everybody in the North or wherever is necessarily focused on the Civil War. There's westward expansion. There's coal miners in Pennsylvania who have their own problems. There's immigration. You know, it's a much more complicated issue. If is it maybe.
Yeah, you want me to? Okay. I think it would have required a heavy commitment from the federal government. To be honest about it. And one of the things that I think the federal government would have had to have done is to have been willing to station thousands and thousands of federal troops in the South, not for 2 or 3 years, but for several years. I think it would have taken the full commitment of the federal government in terms of physically protecting former slaves, making certain that former slaves had access to the ballot. Once the land was redistributed, it would have taken a tremendous amount of government resources to make sure that the land was not taken away from former slaves under dubious circumstances. It would have taken great resources from the federal government in terms of implementing an educational system that was equal. It would have taken the full resources of the federal government to make certain that the 15th Amendment was not made void by the states being able to revamp their constitutions, and it certainly would have taken the full weight of the federal government to knock down, any semblance of constitutionality in terms of racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws. So it would have taken a huge commitment, I think, on the part of the federal government. And I think it was a commitment that was just too broad-based for the federal government to take. And I think really politics came into play because as a consequence of immigration, 1880 to about 1920, where you had about 23 million immigrants coming into the United States, and a large portion coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. Many of those individuals settled in the Midwest and the Northeast. And so what the Republican Party essentially decided is it was too much of a burden, to continue to allocate resources to the South, and promote black political and civil rights, and that the immigrants could now fill the void of the political loss that they would have with respect to abandoning black rights. And plus, it just became I think too complex and just too much of a burden on the federal government. But it would have taken, I think, the full capacity of the federal government to really do the right thing. And the tragedy in all of it is that the federal government missed the opportunity to do that. And as a consequence of that, they allowed the council racism to metastasize. And we're still stuck with the afterfacts of that today.
Right. Very good. Thank you. Andy, you have any comments or?
Sure. Just that the original sin of America is property and humans, and the racism that was required to underpin that system. And I guess I would just end by saying that the only really successful terrorist movement in American history is the KKK after the Civil War. So I don't know. I think we could have done it. I think Ulysses S. Grant beat the crap out of the KKK by using the U.S. Army, but we didn't.
Yep. I think also race played a role in the whole situation. It's a complicated situation with the Civil War. A very unusual situation where you have individuals take up arms, not only take up arms against the federal government, but essentially organize another government, another whole country, really, and then fight, and it lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of individuals, and then to not see these individuals as having committed treason against the federal government is a very unusual thing. Usually, if you pick up arms against the government and you lose, then you die, you're executed, and there's absolutely no sympathy at all with respect to you as a consequence of your actions. And I think race, and the concept of union really complicated the issue where you had brothers going against brothers and cousins going against cousins. And so I think that also limited the capacity or the will of the federal government to, deploy, to put forth all of the necessary resources, because, I think only one individual died as a consequence of their actions, and that person had to do with violating, prisoners,
Right.
and no one else. Even Jefferson Davis wasn't executed. This is a very strange situation, complicated it.
Yeah, very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Anything else, Andy? Does anyone in the audience have any questions, comments for any of the panelists or myself?
Yeah.
So currently, I am teaching in a Reading School District, and I'm teaching a social studies class to long-term ESL students. And one of the things that I see is this environment of not recognizing the water that they're swimming in. And there's a disconnect in one regard when the N-word is just flashed around. Because one of the things that EL students don't necessarily have is the background knowledge of American history to create a context for why that might be inappropriate. So one of the things that I think is necessary in the ESL program is to make sure that we are not just worried about having the students develop their language skills, but also they need to have a particular curriculum that would address the different experiences and see how, from a racially motivated individual, these students would not be left out of the discrimination they would not be separate from African Americans, but actually lumped in and discriminated against. So, do you have any particular suggestions that you could offer up for that?
At Temple University in 2000, we began to, we introduced a course called the Historical Significance of Race and Ethnicity. And we still have that. And so it's tightly coordinated and moderated. And what we make certain that we do within that course is to deal with the experiences of individuals across a broad spectrum. And so we talk about, for instance, how ethnicity was a driving force early on in terms of determining who should be considered as white and therefore eligible for first-class citizenship. And so we look at the experience of the individuals of Irish descent. We look at the experience of individuals of Italian descent, individuals of Russian descent, and we deal with the discrimination and the oppression of various groups of individuals even before they immigrated to the United States, discrimination and oppression from various segments within their own population. And then we deal with the oppression and the discrimination of individuals across the board in the United States. And we point out, for instance, in terms of the Irish, that it was such a struggle for the Irish to assimilate into white American society that it would take until 1960 before the first Irish Catholic was elected president of the United States. And then we emphasize, even at that point, it was a heavy lift, and John F. Kennedy himself was forced to devote an entire speech to his religion, assuring the American people that if they were to elect him, he would not take his marching orders from the Pope. He would be the president of the United States. But that's what we do. And generally what we have them do, or what I have them do, is I have them to conduct oral interviews and write them up in a narrative, and then they give PowerPoint presentations at the end of the class, and that way, all kinds of different experiences bring the class together in terms of, individuals of Irish descent, African descent, individuals of Asian descent, to Hispanics, and the class is knitted together pretty nicely. But that's what we do, and we also introduced a course about 5 years ago called Represent Race, and basically we do some of the same things there, and then we have one other class, Making American History, which is similar, but that's the intent and purposes of what we want to succeed at Temple.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else? I guess then, maybe I know there's a lot of students here, some teachers. Maybe if either of you, if you could recommend one or two or several books, articles that you think would be significant for students to be aware of. I guess I'll start with two. This one's from about 2000, Ira Berlin, Many Thousands Gone, and that's a history of slavery in North America, but it's also looking at what's going on in Louisiana, which is French and Spanish. It's not just English racism. It's slavery is widespread in North America. The other one, fairly recent book, Douglas Egerton, Death or Liberty, which is African Americans in the Revolutionary Era. I recommend both of those.
Okay. You want to?
Death and Liberty by Douglas Egerton. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay.
I have several. Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I'll just list a couple. The first is, I would say, start with a Google search on a guy named James Henry Hammond. James Henry Hammond was a slave owner, and he was also an ideologue who argued in favor of slavery. He thought slavery was a really good thing because he thought slavery is what made democracy possible. There's also a book by Drew Gilpin Faust about him, and the fascinating thing about him is he kept a great diary, so historians love him. And when historians first began writing about James Henry Hammond, they quoted his diary when he said, slaves are dumb. And they would say, well, slaves are dumb. How do we know it? Well, we have this diary that says that they're dumb. But then Drew Gilpin Faust and other later historians looked at that same diary and noticed that all those times when he described slaves being dumb, they were pretending to be too dumb to work. If you look at James Henry Hammond, it's a wonderful example of someone seeing what they want to see through the lens of racism, and historians gradually taking that lens of racism off and saying, well, wait a minute, this very behavior that he's describing as proving that slaves deserve slavery is actually evidence of slaves quietly, passively, subtly, without getting killed, resisting the logic of slavery and resisting the logic of racism.
Yeah.
So I'd start
I
there.
would endorse that book. You can make a case they manipulate him like a puppet, and he doesn't even know it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'll go back to a classic still, John Blassingame, The Slave Community. Yeah, that's the book that I would recommend. And the other book that I would recommend is really a classic, W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction.
I guess one other one I would throw in would be Ed Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom.
Yeah, that's good too.
That would be a good one.
The one that I mentioned at the beginning, Ibram Kendi, is his book, Stamped from the Beginning, A Comprehensive History of Racism. It's worthwhile reading because it's incredibly well written, and it won the National Book Prize, it was, I think, 2 years ago, if not last year. But also because, better than anyone else, he exposes the logic of racism just in the words of previous historians and in everyday life. And instead of using the term slavery, a lot of times he uses the word captive, for example. So Ibram Kendi, Kendi.
Do you have a question here?
Dr. Jenkins, Slave Community by who?
Blassingame?
What's that?
Who's the
The
author?
book Slave Community, that's
Yeah,
Blassingame?
John Blassingame, The Slave Community, yeah. Yeah.
And Du Bois' book?
W.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction.
And Morgan's?
American Slavery, American Freedom. And I guess, one other thing, and we kind of concentrated Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction as an early Americanist. Slavery is very complicated, and there's differences in North and South, and it's an evolving nature, and the Revolutionary era changes the dimensions to some degree. And it's a much bigger topic than, unfortunately, we could get to talk about in a mere 1 hour.
Yeah, because it's certainly the slave experience is certainly different during the colonial period in New England than in the South.
Correct, correct. Yes. 2 minutes? All right. Any last? Go ahead,
I think
Andy.
Bernard had a
Oh,
question.
go ahead.
One other book that you have not mentioned is John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom,
That would be a good one.
which is an excellent book and a great read for students in high school especially. And one comment I wanted to make about Reconstruction as a historian myself, that during that period of time after slavery has been ended in America, numerous schools began to educate this mass of people who are now largely uneducated because it was illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. You could be killed. The person who was doing it and the person who was receiving the learning. So crops of schools, which has resulted and roughly about 117 which have survived as what we know as the HBCUs today. I'm an HBCU graduate, Fisk University, and that impacted a lot of people. And in those typical classrooms, you would see a young child to an old person, because everybody was yearning to learn how to read and to write. So that was very important. And today it is not common to see. This room should be packed, because our young people, in reference to your question, nobody wants to know about history. And it's an amazing topic. As a historian, I think it's an amazing topic. But it's an amazing topic to learn about who you are, where you've come from, because otherwise, as that adage says, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, we are in a process right now that we're repeating some things in history that should never be repeated. So I urge our young people here, our students especially, don't come just for extra credit. Come because you are seeking the knowledge to better understand who you are and who the other people that you interact with are, because this is a diverse community. We want it to be diverse, but we want to know as much as possible about each other so that we can learn from our mistakes and not repeat those horrible elements. Because if you did not know, 4,800 men and women were hung, were lynched. And it was an event in many cases, because families, white families, would bring their children, they pack a lunch, we're going to a lynching today. And it was a horrible event. And it was not until Billie Holiday, the late Billie Holiday, the jazz singer, popularized it with her song Strange Fruit, that people began to take a little more notice of it. But as a boy growing up in Mississippi, about 55 miles from Philadelphia, Mississippi, I knew the father of one of those boys. I've known him all my life. Ben Chaney was the father of the young James Chaney, who got hung. And to look in his eyes growing up to see that his son would never reach full maturity because he was hung with two white boys because of their involvement with the civil rights movement. That was painful growing up. And I knew this man. I'd been to his house all my life. And to know that his son was one of those that was lynched in Philadelphia, Mississippi, was traumatic.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any last comments? We're out of time pretty much.
I have one last comment. So I've been sitting here, this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and I want to go back to the comparison to anti-bullying. This conference was well publicized, but it also, I just wrote the note that I screwed up because I teach a class in constitutional history, I teach a class in early U.S. history. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning of the semester, I didn't integrate this conference into my syllabus. I didn't make it part of my lesson plans. I didn't integrate it into my classes such that students would feel as if they didn't come to this conference, there'd be a hole in their education. So in that sense, I'm thinking about how do we administrate conferences like this and integrate them into the way that we just simply teach our classes and do our educational experience into what it means to be here at KU. How do we integrate conferences such as this into the water that we swim in? And I think it's an interesting question. I'm glad there's administrator leaders here, and one worth talking about. Ultimately, if we're going to have a conference on racism or anti-racism, it means how do we think about how we would change our entire culture, our entire way of teaching, such that conferences like this are a part of it. That conference I went to at Bard, they walked students, filed students in to the front row. And I don't know if that's because they recognized that they too, on that private school, beautiful campus, had failed to integrate that conference on the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism into their curriculum, or because they had.
Yeah.
So.
one last comment. My first job was at West Virginia University. And what we did is we put together a Sojourner Truth Nelson Mandela colloquium. And that way, professors who taught sociology and psychology and history and political science each year would incorporate their classes within the framework of that conference. And so the students were required to attend presentations, and they were given points in terms of writing up their observations and even going before class talking about their observations of what had taken place at the conferences. It was pretty rewarding, to be honest about it. So I think that's a way of looking at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.